Hello everyone. Razorblade Mango here. So it's been a very long time since I've done a video like this. I think the last time I did something like this was when the final Rambo movie came out, where I looked at a review of it that I did not like and dissected it. So I'm going to do the same for the recent movie called Weapons, which is a new horror film from writer and director Zach Kreger, who was one of the guys in The Whitest Kids You Know. And his last movie was the hit horror film Barbarian. Now, to say up front, I am not a fan of Zach Kreger. I'm not a fan of Barbarian. I thought it was very sloppy once the first third passed. And I thought the shame about Barbarian is I thought the first third of it was really, really good. But then it unfortunately changed into something that I found to be a lot less compelling. And his latest movie, Weapons, I actually think is an improvement on Barbarian, but I still have some big issues with Weapons. I don't think it's great. I wouldn't even call it very good. I would, if I were forced to give it a letter score or something like that, I'd probably give it a B minus. I'd probably go for something like that. But the praise that I've been seeing around Weapons to me is, I feel, overblown, and I would like to see more reviews that are actually critical of it, because I think there are some big problems with how it executes its blending of tone, its humor, which I think is very distracting at times and doesn't gel well with the more serious elements that Kreger is trying to tackle. I think the logic of the movie starts to get out of hand. I'm willing to go to a certain point with Kreger when it comes to logical gaps in Weapons, because one of the influences that Weapons clearly has is the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, and it's almost like a modern fairy tale. So with a fairy tale surrealist logic, I'm willing to go to a certain point as far as accepting logical gaps. But especially during the final chapter, Weapons just piles question after question after question after question after logical gap after logical gap after logical gap after logical gap that I could see being addressed in the movie if they had, if Kreger had more wisely utilized where the focus was in the movie, because I feel like the focus is in the wrong areas at certain points. And Kreger, I don't know why he's so open about this, because it makes him sound like a hack, to be quite frank. I don't know why Kreger is so open about the fact that he does not outline his movies before writing them. He kind of just sits at his his computer and just says, "Jesus, take the wheel," and just lets his fingers type out whatever goes onto the page. I think when he says that, there is a little bit of, exaggeration to it, that he just outline he doesn't outline his stuff at all, because there are elements of Weapons where you have to be thinking a few steps ahead in order to set stuff up early in the morning. It is early in the morning as I'm recording this. Early in the film, that pays off later and is referenced later. And it does drop little clues during the first few moments of the movie as to what's going on later in it. And I think it's really cool how it does that. So I don't know how much of Kreger saying that he doesn't outline his movies is true, but I don't know why he openly admits that. I don't know if he's trying to create some mystique around his work or something like that. It definitely shows with Barbarian. I'll say that. It shows a little bit less with Weapons, but once you get to that final act, there are just some things that I look at and I go, Krieger clearly did not think this through. So that's why I think reviews that are more negative and critical are important, because I think, unfortunately, film criticism culture is in this space where it's almost like these reviews are written in the most shallow way imaginable, where they really don't get into the nitty-gritty of the movie itself. I feel like film criticism is at a terrible point. It's been at a terrible point for many years, but it's just getting worse. And you really have to go outside the bounds of mainstream criticism to find good stuff. For instance, there's a YouTube channel that I really like called Kicking the Seat that has panel discussions for movies where they don't review everything, but they'll talk about newer works, they'll talk about older stuff, and I quite enjoy listening to them. So one of the people that I feel like does provide value as far as an outside voice outside of the mainstream is film critic Armond White. And if you don't know that, if you know that name, there's a good chance that you probably rolled your eyes when I said that I find Armond White to be a valuable voice in the film criticism scene. But if you don't know who Armond White is, he's been a writer for many decades. He people probably know him more famously for his, he wouldn't say, like, I know he hates this, if he ever listens to this, I apologize, his contrarian views, and I put that in quotes, where he hates movies that are very, very popular, like The Dark Knight, Wall-E, Get Out, just to name a few. And then he will highly praise movies that are critically lambasted, like Adam Sandler's Jack and Jill, a lot of Adam Sandler films, actually, Eddie Murphy's Norbit, those Michael Bay Transformers movies, the Paul W.S. Anderson Resident Evil movies. I think most of those he really likes. A lot of Zack Snyder's work, like Batman v Superman. I love Batman v Superman, by the way. Probably one of the only like 3 people in the world that love that movie. But so I think Armond White is a very valuable voice, and I think Armond White is a really, really good writer when he gets out of his own way. As far as, how do I put this? I think Armond White is at its best, or is at his best, when he really narrows in on what the heart of the movie is and is not distracted by all of these other political conservative buzzwords or talking points that are kind of awkwardly shoehorned in to some of his work. And you're gonna see that in this weapons review when I get around to analyzing it. But there's a book that I really like from Armond White called The Resistance, and it's this book where it's a collection of his writings from the mid 80s to the mid 90s, and it's kind of the central thesis of the book is showing how pop culture changed during that decade long period. And I think that book is really, really excellent. He's written a couple books that I find to be really, 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 really good. He did a book about Tupac Shakur that I think is really good. He did a book about his latest book. It was about a collection of works, both old and new, about Steven Spielberg, which I think is a really good book. So I guess I would call myself a fan of Armond White, even though I deeply disagree with a lot of his work a lot of the time. But one thing I wouldn't call Armond White is lazy or half-assed, because I think when he's at his very best, he can be very, very insightful. And I think there is a lot of value to somebody coming in and not marching lockstep with the status quo. But there has to be substance to back up his criticism. And unfortunately, especially more recently, I find that some of his reviews lack substance. And I feel like they're more written for the National Review readers rather than people who are serious about film criticism. It feels like some of these reviews that he writes, especially for a rag sheet like the National Review, they more placate to the audience, that the readership that National Review gets. And there's a sense to appealing to a publication's writers that you're writing for. But I feel like Armond White goes overboard with trying to awkwardly, like I mentioned before, awkwardly shoehorn in buzzwords and political talking points. So we're going to take a look at his review for Weapons, which again, I am not, I'm totally for a review coming in and knocking it down a peg or two. But unfortunately, I think Armond White missed an opportunity to really provide some substance as to why elements of Weapons just does not work. I would argue just objectively just don't really work for the movie, just as far as the logic goes for it. So we're going to look at down here. And I'm not going to read the full thing, but I am going to pick certain paragraphs and kind of go like, huh? like, okay. So we'll start with director Zach Cregger is among the legion of Hollywood hacks. And among them is like Ari Aster, Ty West, Robert Eggers, Jane Schoenbrunn. I don't think I've ever seen a movie from her. Jordan Peele, who specialize in the horror genre not to spook us, but to use storytelling against us. In Weapons, Cregger's story about a suburban community where 17 school kids have vanished into the night evokes contemporary social horror, as if to make sense of the many mass murders of youths that haunt our society. Okay, this is something that I've seen a lot from people, even people I know personally who have messaged me, who have seen Weapons, or they'll send me, like one of my good friends who I talk to like every day. He sent me a text of one of his friends texting him their interpretation of Weapons, and it was about, it's something I've seen before, including the kicking the seat panel that they did about Weapons, where people see Weapons as an allegory for school shootings and the aftermath of them in a community. Now, I think that is a reasonable interpretation. I think there are some things you can point to in Weapons that point to that. Unfortunately, because Cregger openly just does not think through his movies, that interpretation doesn't have a lot of mileage to me. I think you can make the case that it does this in more so the first fifth of the movie, where there are images like an entire classroom of students not showing up, the fact that the parents are outraged and looking for someone to blame, so they target the teacher of the class that has nothing to do with the children's disappearance. There's a bit where Josh Brolin's character, and spoilers, by the way, there's I didn't mention that up front, there's gonna be spoilers for Weapons in this review, actually, which I'm kind of annoyed with. I'd be annoyed if I hadn't seen it before I read this review. But there's a moment in Weapons where Josh Brolin's character is having a dream, and in the dream he's outside of his house, and he looks up into the sky and he sees this large assault rifle weapon with the time 2:17 a.m. on it, which is the time that all the children disappeared in the movie. So people see that and they go, that's evidence that this movie is about school shootings. It's an allegory for school shootings and their impact on the community, their impact on the parents of the children that got killed. But then you have Zach Cregger, when he's directly asked about this AR in Josh Brolin's dream, he just kind of shrugs his shoulders and goes, I don't know what that means. I wrote that just because. Like, again, I just let Jesus take the wheel and I just wrote it. There's really no meaning to it. So, again, I just don't really have much respect for Zach Cregger as a thoughtful, intelligent filmmaker. In fact, I think he gets way too much credit. I think even Armond White gives him way too much credit as far as what he's intentionally putting into Weapons or Barbarian as well. Now, could Zach Cregger be lying? It's possible he could be lying, and he could just be saying that nonsense just to boost up the mystique around him. But I think there is evidence that his very unthoughtful, scattershot approach to writing, it's definitely there in the feel of his movies, like Barbarian Weapons, because they just change tones so quickly, like at the drop of a hat. So I don't think, I don't think, until there was like one instance late in like the final act of the movie that I do feel like there actually was work into making the allegory of the movie kind of pop more than the fact that people see that it's about school shootings. And lo and behold, that's the element of the movie that Krieger is very open about, saying that he put a lot of thought and time into. That's exactly what he was going for, which is about alcoholism. And the whole final chapter of Weapons is about what I didn't see, like, this is one of the rare movies where I went into it, didn't see any of the trailers, didn't see any of the plot beyond what's on the poster of the movie. Didn't see, I think the most I saw was maybe like less than a second of footage when I was just scrolling through Google one day looking up the movie, because I was curious to see it, just because the core premise of it sounded interesting. So when I saw the movie and I watched the final act of it, the thing that really got into my mind was, oh, this is about alcoholism, or this is about it's about alcoholism or abuse in a household, and how that creates a specter over the whole house, the whole family. And especially considering the child has to take care of their parents, they have to take care of other people. And that reflects that, you know, when a parent or guardian is a drug addict or addicted to alcohol or neglectful, the child has to become the parent, has to become the guardian in that case, especially if they have a younger sibling or if they have another parent that is being abused or neglected. So it's very reflective of that. And I feel like that, like when I was watching the movie without hearing anything about it, that's what I thought. And I thought there's no way that this is not what Zach Krieger intentionally designed this final act to be reflective of. And lo and behold, Zach Krieger says, that is exactly what I was going for, because I've lived it. And I went, okay, so there is evidence for that, because that's the part of the movie, the allegory, that feels a lot more fleshed out than the school shooting. So, but a lot of people just seem really latched onto that school shooting allegory, when I just feel like there's no real good, I mean, there could have been, and this is where I find Krieger to be insufficient as a filmmaker. I feel like he could have fleshed out the school shooting allegory, but a lot of people are kind of just seeing what they want to see, and it's the whole like death the author kind of thing. But anyway, back to the review. Krieger's conceit in Weapons vilifies the everyday conventions of suburban America, meaning to undermine and destroy them. It gets political, and again, here we go. It gets political when a school board meeting, that flashpoint where concerned parents question the Department of Education. Again, there's a political talking point that's kind of awkwardly shoehorned in there. Exposes the vulnerabilities of both homemakers and authorities. Angry, bereaved dad Archer Graff, played by Josh Brolin, displays his toxic male menace and attacks the flaky school teacher Justine, Julia Garner, revealing her personal off-hours flaws. There are many. Beneath the mystery of the mass vanishings, routine middle-class sins, like drugs, sex, neglect, are divulged. So let's start with up here, where it vilifies the everyday conventions of suburban America, undermine and destroy them. So I need Armond White to kind of more specifically go into what that means. And I feel like this is something that Armond White just throws out without really backing it up or really adding much substance. Like, how does Weapons vilify the everyday conventions of suburban America, meaning to undermine and destroy them? What conventions of suburban America is Weapons seeking to undermine and destroy? When you say something like this, you need a lot more substance to it. And here we go. It gets political. And again, this is something that people are really latching onto that I just don't think the movie really. I think it evokes imagery of. I'll go that far. It evokes imagery of the aftermath of a school shooting, but it just doesn't really go there as far as fleshing it out. When school board meeting, again, mentioning the Department of Education, it's connecting into some kind of recent political talking point, which plays into the National Review audience. Angry, bereaved dad, Archer Graff, displays his toxic male menace and attacks the flaky school teacher, revealing her personal off-hours flaws. So, I definitely don't think calling it toxic male menace is accurate, because the reason why Archer Graff is upset with Justine is because there is no one to blame who is connected. There's no one physically present to blame who is connected to the disappearance of his child, who is among the 17 children that disappear in the dead of night. So, like a lot of people do in tragedies, he attacks somebody who is just there. They're unfortunately just there. And they are connected to the case, but they're not the person who did it. But they still get the blowback because people need something, especially when you're dealing with a confusing tragedy, like your child disappearing in the middle of the night. It's very natural that somebody will latch on to, like, they need something physical to blame. That's why people, when they get angry at something that they can't take their physical aggression out on, they take it out on whatever is closest to them. Like, if somebody gets yelled at by their boss at work, they'll go home and hit their dog out of frustration or something. It's something along those lines. And it's not exactly the same scenario, but it's all about displacement, where he is not displaying his toxic male menace. And I think Armond White just unfortunately puts this in there because he's accusing the movie of showing Josh Brolin's toxic male menace as a bad thing, when I feel like one of the biggest compliments I can give Weapons is that a lot of the main characters are deeply flawed people. And I found that to be very refreshing, where there's no real good person in this movie per se. Because Archer Graff, that he mentions that he is neglectful. It's implied that he was neglectful of his child, in particular with Josh Brolin kind of being a little bit of a bully and kind of intimidating to certain characters at points in the movie. And that's seen in how his child treats children in his classroom in scenes that we see, that he is also a bully, which is very common among bullies, that their fathers or their parents are bullies as well. And Justine is also not a squeaky clean character at all, because of the abuse and attention that she's getting for her assumed role in the disappearance of these children. She starts going back to drinking because she's an alcoholic. She succeeds in tempting her. I think he's either married or he's engaged. So she gets her engaged or married ex-boyfriend to sleep with her out of comfort. And then also that ex-boyfriend, who's a cop, he's very corrupt. He makes a lot of mistakes in the movie. Again, he cheats on his wife, fiance. He starts drinking again because he meets up with Justine at a bar. So I think the fact that Armond White, again, doesn't really acknowledge this as a compliment of the movie kind of shows his... I don't know exactly what he thinks he's doing as far as mentioning this, revealing that attacks the flaky school teacher, revealing her personal off-hours flaws. There are many. Beneath the mystery of the mass vanishings, routine middle-class sins, drugs, sex, neglect are divulged. And he talks about another movie that satirized parental flaws in this brilliant other film, but horror gives Krager an easy way out. And I just don't I don't agree with that, because these characters are put through the ringer as far as their flaws. We can see them pretty openly, and the movie makes no qualms about hiding it. And I think I think it's risky I think it was risky of Kreger to write these characters like this, where they're just all very deeply flawed. And I give him a lot of credit for that, but I guess Armond White does not, because he thinks it's displaying their middle class sins, and then he doesn't really take it much further, which I guess I'll give Armond White that it doesn't like take it to the extreme as far as exploring these characters. And again, I think that has to do with Kreger not really outlining his scripts, but I think the fact that he does provide interesting characterizations, flawed characterizations for all these characters, is something that should be commended. But I guess Armond White disagrees. So, yeah. Horror is the genre that permits gleeful, goose-pimply destruction of the family and religious conventions. And this is something that Armond White does that I'm not really crazy about, where he will like rapid fire off these movies that he does not like, and then he connects it to recent political or just political concepts and topics in general, without really, again, giving much substance to why that's the case. Like, I don't know how Nosferatu, I haven't seen Sinners, I haven't seen Eddington, I haven't seen 28 Years Later. I have seen Nosferatu. I don't know how Nosferatu manipulates generalized feelings of inadequacy, insecurity, and fright that have arisen ever since 9/11, followed by periodic mass killings and then exacerbated by COVID's lockdown psyops. Nosferatu's a fucking vampire movie, dude. It's an allegory for like an abusive ex-boyfriend coming back into town. And if you really want to go that far, you can definitely make a case that Nosferatu is an allegory of an ex-abusive boyfriend coming back into somebody's life when they've moved on to happier and greener pastures. You could go that far, but connecting it to inadequacy, insecurity, and fright that have arisen ever since 9/11. I don't know what the hell 9/11 has to do with Nosferatu or weapons. Okay. Instead of a serious approach to those issues and examining widespread individual political antagonism, Kreger toys with chaos. Despite some stylistic extravagance, Weapons is, at its core, an exploitation movie. Which, again, I don't think the exploitation part, I think that more is unintentional, again, because Kreger is not a thoughtful filmmaker. And I think there is a case to be made that Kreger unintentionally does exploit feelings, like the mass shooter allegory. But again, there's really there's no meat to this review. He doesn't really, just when he like presents an idea, Armond White then just like steers into something else, or tries to do his typical machine gun approach of hitting like multiple targets at once by painting them under the same umbrella of this political umbrella that I just feel like is very insufficient. And I feel like it does his intelligence or Armond's vast experience as a film critic and a film analyzer a disservice, because I feel like he's not talking about it in a very in-depth, evidence-driven way. It's just this very general like malaise of political talking points and political jargon and buzzwords that I feel like just I don't, when I read this review, I don't learn anything. I don't gain any insight. In fact, I just grow more frustrated when I look at it. So, millennial pop culture doesn't just twist the truth and distort our thoughts. Film and TV makers who largely share the same liberal political leanings actively attack our sensibilities and fears, which again, there's the addition of gotta hit the libs. Weapons derives suspense from the trauma of parents and communities that go through school shooting. And again, here's the fucking school shootings thing again. The phenomenon is allegorized by the specificity of 17 missing grade school students and one exception, Alex. These are not just neighborhood casualties. They're victims of a witch, Alex's Aunt Gladys, played by Amy Madigan, who's excellent in the movie, by the way, who casts a spell that is the occasion for Kreger's sop to secularism and other creepy stereotypes. And again, what does he mean by Kreger's sop to secularism? I don't understand. What does that mean? Like Armond White needs to give me more specificity as far as what that means and other creepy stereotypes. And I guess if he's meaning stereotypes as in tropes, which I think that's fair because the presence of Gladys, the witch in Weapons, it is reflective of certain iconography from like she does look like Pennywise from a distance at a few points. You can make a case that Hocus Pocus is an inspiration on the movie. The Witches, which is the Roald Dahl book that was turned into a movie, that could be an inspiration, of course. Grimm's fairy tales, like I mentioned earlier, that could be an inspiration, but there is no specificity to this. So I don't know what Armond White means by other creepy stereotypes. And this is the one I'm like, what? Like Kreger's sop to secularism. That I don't understand at all. Because again, I think in order to try to brute force his point about how Kreger is trying to create a liberal talking point about guns. He's just it's like tunnel vision focused on the school shooter, the unintentional school shooter imagery. And I feel like there is just no substance in the movie to where that is true. But Armond White takes that, which really is just it's maybe only a part of like the first fifth again of the movie. It's only in the first 2 chapters does it really go for that kind of imagery and unintentional allegory. But Armond White is just he's so locked in on just that it's like I just feel like it colors this whole review. And again, I don't learn anything because I don't know what he's talking about half the time. So, in the aftermath of Sandy Hook, Aurora, Colorado, Parkland, Florida, and Nashville, he's like putting in this like very awkward conservative talking point with its suspiciously guarded manifesto of a trans shooter. I don't know what that has to do with weapons, but okay. Kreger's reliance on the occult suggests a deliberate choice to neglect the political tragedy of mass shootings and out-of-control parenting. What does this have to do with the movie? It's a witch, dude. It's Mr. White. A big influence of the movie is Roald Dahl's fairy tales. There is a witch in Brothers Grimm fairy tales and Roald Dahl as well, if with the witches. That has nothing to do with. It's not like Kreger sat at his computer and went, you know what would be a great out because I don't know how to develop this mass shooter thing? A witch! Just fuck it. Which maybe he did think I'm just gonna throw a witch in there and see how it goes. But Kreger clearly did not do this as an out to where he can stop talking about the political tragedy of mass shootings and out of control parenting. I just don't see the evidence there. And again, it's all about him trying to awkwardly pivot to a conservative political talking point in order to appease the readers of National Review, which is why he mentions secularism, which is why he mentions trans shooter, all these buzzwords. This was also the theme. That doesn't really have anything to do with weapons, but it's You see what I mean? It's just this really awkward insertion of just political buzzwords and talking points that just doesn't really go anywhere, and it just really undercuts any kind of point that Armond White is trying to make. So Kreger salts the wound and, in the name of studio entertainment, seeks to normalize social disturbance and cultural radicalization that are the real threats to spiritual solace and public peace. I just don't know what he's talking about. Despite the 6-narrator story structure, these children have no traits that stand for society at large. Which I don't... These children have no traits that stand for society at large. Which, again, if he's talking about these children are not well defined as characters, then I think there could be a point, but that's not what the movie's going for. Dude, it's the... Okay. I think people give Kreger way too much credit as just this thoughtful filmmaker and writer. And I think this is why it irritates me when people, because I've seen this now with Weapons, where people are calling Kreger a master of horror after just 2 movies. It's like, dude, Kreger ain't a master of nothing, okay? The biggest strength that Kreger has is when he plays it straight and creates unsettling images and set pieces. That was the best stuff in Barbarian, when he played it straight, when he focused on paranoia, when he focused on creating suspense. I think he's very good at suspense. I would go so far as to say there are moments in Weapons that are excellent moments of suspense and unsettling imagery. Beyond that, though, no, he is not a thoughtful master of horror. No way. I like seriously groan anytime somebody says that or writes it. But again, Armond White has an opportunity to explain why this is not the case, but he just goes for these like 1-sentence takedowns that just don't have any substance or evidence attached to them. It's frustrating to read. So anyway, this is the last thing that I will say, or the part that I will read. And again, reviewers who celebrate, and again, he always has to go, I think he goes after film reviewers a little too much sometimes, but I think this is a case where it could be justified. But again, he doesn't really take it anywhere. Reviewers who celebrate Kreger's impudence, his imagination runs to instances of comically grotesque face stabbings, self-mutilation, and cannibalism, can rightly be accused of collaborating with his weaponization of, quote, entertainment, unquote. Kreger expands social catastrophe without offering spiritual enlightenment. Media endorsement of this trash, the normalization of weaponization, is an outrage. So again, and him calling it horror porn as well. You need more than just this in your review if you're going to say things this inflammatory. And again, like, this is the part that I have the most issue with in this paragraph. His imagination runs to instances of comically grotesque face stabbing, self-mutilation, and cannibalism, which he considers a weaponization of entertainment and its impudence. Another big inspiration of this movie is very clearly the early movies of Sam Raimi and Peter Jackson, when they were making these like splatter, gore, dark comedies. Movies like The Evil Dead, movies like Bad Taste or Brain Dead. If you've never seen Brain Dead, it's a very funny, very, very gory horror movie from Peter Jackson, who went on to direct the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which it's like, what? When you look at like Lord of the Rings trilogy and you look at these like gory ass horror movies, it's like, how the hell did the same person direct these two things? That's some talent. That's some like genre diversity. But that's very clearly an influence on Weapons when it gets to the more gory things. So I don't think this is a sign of Kreger's impudence. It's not a weaponization of entertainment. It's Kreger's taking unsettling images and like comically grotesque things from movies like The Evil Dead, movies like brain dead, like bad taste. So I don't know what Armond White's point is here. I don't know if he just doesn't like movies like Brain Dead or The Evil Dead. I don't know, but it's like the point completely flies over his head that this is what Kreger was going for. He was going for The Evil Dead. He was going for these like gory ass early 80s or just 80s in general movies that really push the envelope as far as what is acceptable as far as violence, even in independently funded entertainment. Those movies caused controversy because of how violent they were. There's a reason they're cult classics. There's a reason they were big hits at like midnight screenings and stuff like that. It's because they're just so, again, like I think Armond White says it perfectly, comically grotesque. That's the point of a lot of the violence in the movie. It's meant to elicit humor. And I don't think in Weapons it works most of the time. And I think Armond White could make a case about that, but he just fails to do so. But I think the ending is definitely, I think it earns its comedy. I laughed. It was the one time in the movie I laughed that I thought was funny because I felt like they earned it. But just Armond White, he just sounds like old man yelling at clouds when he looks at a movie that is taking inspiration from The Evil Dead and gory splatter horror movies of the 80s and saying that it's a weaponization of entertainment, and he has to put entertainment in quotes to be even more derogatory. So yeah, I just think this review is a major missed opportunity for Armond White to like, because Armond White is smarter than this. There might be a chance that Armond White sees this and not like what I have to say, but I think if Armond White ever sees this, I want him to know that I don't dislike the guy. I don't dislike his writing. In fact, I have a great amount of respect for his writing. I just feel like when he writes something like this kind of review, it just does a complete disservice to his intelligence and his experience and his knowledge and his expertise. And that's, to me, is the greatest disappointment of this review, because I do feel like Weapons needs to be taken down a peg or two. I've seen some outrageously hyperbolic things said about it and Zach Kreger, but Armond White, it's like he just completely misses the mark. He just throws an air ball. So I just feel like there's so many things in this review that are just completely lack substance, that I feel like Armond, and I'll give Armond White the benefit of the doubt, because I feel like Armond White, he is at his best when he is talking to somebody, because he'll occasionally do interviews with I'm really shilling for kicking the seat, but I like the channel a lot. That's actually how I discovered that channel, because of an interview that the main guy on that channel did with he's done a couple interviews with Armond White now, and I think they're really good. And I think the reviews that the main guy on Kicking the Seat and Armond White do are actually like really, really good. I think Armond White provides good points. I think he has a good back and forth with the guy. I just really like listening to Armond White because it's outside of the realm of this very like national review politicized, gotta appease the hardcore conservatives that read this site kind of mindset. So I think if Armond White were to go on Kicking the Seat and talk to Ian, the main guy on Kicking the Seat, talked about Weapons, I feel like he'd provide a lot more substance. He'd provide a lot more evidence. He'd have a good back and forth with them. But in this isolated review, I just feel like Armond White had a really good opportunity to take the movie down a peg or two and to kind of throw some cold water on the insane hype that it's been getting. And rather than throwing cold water on the movie, he kind of just missed, and all the cold water landed on the wall next to him. It was just like, well, it's a waste of cold water. And Armond White's just kind of standing there with an empty bucket in his hand, kind of just awkwardly like, yeah, take that, libs. So anyway, thank you all for listening. I know this went on longer than I thought, but I just have a lot of thoughts about Weapons in this review that unfortunately just misses the mark in many ways. So anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you all later. Goodbye.